Hello there, my name's Lee Matthews and I'm a physiotherapist, and this is Pilates Rehab Relax. So we've escaped my house today. I'm taking you out for a walk. The weather's good, the sun's shining, it's a beautiful day around here, and I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about what we call pacing. So pacing might be something you think, well, what's the point of that? But actually there's a huge relevance to it. With any condition, it might be that you've just had an episode of back pain or even a sprained ankle or something, and you're trying to get over it and get back onto a football field or a sports pitch. It could be that you're trying to get back to work after some sort of thing you've been through. And there's also things like long-term conditions, things like fibromyalgia, anything with a fatigue component to it, such as long COVID. And even things like back pain. You know, sometimes we've got to live well with those symptoms rather than being able to eradicate them. And under those circumstances, pacing can be a really useful tool. You know, whilst you can't always get rid of some of these things, you can certainly manage the symptoms well, and in doing so, reduce the amount of suffering that goes with it, and hopefully it will keep you doing the things you love and enjoy, with having fewer days where you can't do those things. So why do we do that then? You know, sometimes it's established behaviour we've got. You know, I'm not going to let this beat me, let's fight this. But the trouble is that fighting symptoms can sometimes lead to less activity and actually longer periods of distress and upset to go with it. We might have been doing things in a certain way for decades. You know, it might be that our family or our colleagues rely on us doing certain things. So this is about making small changes, maybe sometimes about changing the way we look at things around us. And it might be that you start small with some of these things. It's not always easy, it's not always possible, but if it can help a little bit, then it's definitely worth to try and do some of those things. So what we sometimes encounter is what we call a boom bust cycle. So we have a good patch, a good day where you feel okay with things, or maybe you've got people coming around to visit and you need to clean the house and tidy everything up. But we're feeling good, so we just try and get on with things. You know, there's pressures to achieve because of family, because of work, because of our own expectations on ourselves. The trouble is that you might try and do things the way you've always been doing, clean the whole house from top to bottom, or go for a big long run in a way that you used to before you were having some problems, but then it causes your symptoms to what we call flare up, so you get a return of those symptoms. So from that good patch, you then end up with a bad patch for a couple of days, you know, maybe more than that. And in that time, that's where we're not able to do the things we want to. That's where the suffering happens. And alongside that suffering, there's inactivity. You know, we might find we encounter things like joint stiffness, we decondition, and the muscles get weaker because they're not being used. And we get negative reinforcement that movement, that doing those things is a bad thing, because when we did it, we failed, we didn't achieve what we wanted to. So you can continue to fight things. You know, sometimes there's only good intentions behind those things, but maybe it's time to look at things a little bit differently. Maybe it's time to try and find other ways of doing things that maybe allow you to succeed. It might involve a bit more planning, it might involve conceding some things, but you know, if you end up being in the place you want to, doing the things you want to a bit more easily, then that's definitely a worthwhile investment, I think. So what we're advocating is a little and often approach, that actually just doing a small amount each day, you know, yes, you won't get as much done, but actually if you did the same amount for 3 days, rather than having one very active day followed by 2 where you couldn't do anything, then the net gain is still there, isn't it? And even with things like going for a walk, I'd much rather know that you were walking for a short walk each day, maybe 5 minutes, than going for half an hour and then finding out you were flat on your back for 3 days afterwards. So this is a kinder approach. It's a softly approach. It's not always easy, and you might tell me that it's impossible for certain things, and in which case we try and prepare for that. We try and space our week around it so that we've got time to mop up some of those symptoms, to recover a little bit. And it might be with things like returning to sport. that rather than just rushing back on a football pitch, that you have to concede to doing a slow rehab towards it, like a series of stepping stones laid out in front of you, where you do some sport-specific exercise, sometimes nothing to do with what you want to return to, but in doing so, in achieving that, you then are able to jump to the next stepping stone. It's a kind of way of doing things. It can be really frustrating at times, but it might lead to success, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So pacing isn't easy. It can be quite challenging, and I think it's a lot harder than doing things like exercise, because pacing is about changing behaviour, changing the way we look about things, and sometimes it can involve some difficult conversations, and that's not always a one-off thing. Sometimes it's a recurring thing where you have to talk to people that you work with or that you live with. Pacing's difficult because we've got lots of responsibilities in our life, at home, with family, with work. It's difficult because there's only so many hours in the day, but maybe there's some small things that you can look at. Maybe there's some ways you can do things slightly differently that will help. And it can apply to lots of things. Things like walking, things like hobbies, like gardening. It might be a sport that you do, whether it's bowls or running around a football pitch. But whatever it is, start small. Pick something that you want to do, something that's achievable, something that you enjoy that's slipping out from between your fingers, that you want to get back to doing a bit more of or a bit better. But whatever it is, even if it's a housework, pick a baseline. Find something that you can achieve to do that doesn't provoke your symptoms. So that might be that you do a task on 3 or 4 occasions and work out what your tolerance is. It might be the number of shirts you can iron, it might be how many rooms you can hoover, it could be how long you can sit down for, it might be how long you can jog for around the park or go for a walk. Either way, work out on 4 different occasions how much you did before you got sore, and from that work out on average. So that might be a very different amount on successive days or on successive occasions, but whatever that average is of your tolerance, so whatever it is, take a small amount off of that, and then you're going to establish what your baseline of activity is. So if you could iron 5 shirts before you got irritable, it might be you just iron 4 shirts. If you can walk for 8 minutes on one day, 10 minutes on another day, and 6 minutes on another day, you average out those, and then from that average, which would be 8 minutes, take off 20% or thereabouts, then repeat that on a regular basis. And because we're doing a small amount, because we're doing a sub-threshold amount that doesn't trigger our symptoms, we continue to succeed. And it's frustrating because you might still have a pile of ironing to look at, or you might not have got around the park walking the way you used to. But doing a small amount and being a little bit kinder to yourself can continue to have more and more good days. So, rather than having a good day where you do loads and then have a bad day where you can do nothing, without those extremes, we're looking for something in the middle there, a bit more of a wavy line than these big peaks and troughs that we sometimes get with our activity. But in doing so, we don't get the soreness, we get less inactivity, and the net average amount of activity will actually be more over time there. Once you've established that baseline, then start to add small increments, and don't try and do a little bit more every single time. The typical thing is you go swimming and the next time you try and do double the amount and then double the amount, and before you know it there's this mountain in front of you and you get fearful and avoidant of doing those things. What I want you to do is get that baseline, take 20% off, and then continue to do that. And before you add any more increments, I want you to consolidate that. So it might be that for your exercise or for what that activity is, you do that for a couple of weeks even. And once it becomes more comfortable, more achievable, then add an increment back on again. So that might take you back to your level of tolerance. And so with our walking, we might now be back to walking for 8 minutes each day around the park. And again, a couple of weeks later, you might add another increment of 20%. So then we go to 10 minutes. But each time we have that little stepping stone. Each time we build up a small increment, and then we build on it slowly. So with things like work, Can you have a graded return? So a lot of companies in the UK now do return to work and phased reintroductions into the workplace. And sometimes it's about getting a little bit more help with some of the more manual tasks, or looking at the positions that you sit in when you're at work, or the positions, is it ergonomic? Is there any way that you can adjust your chair or get up from your chair every half an hour to move around in a way that will be more kind on those symptoms that you get there? Sometimes people adjust their hours so that they don't commute during rush hour, or they vary the amount of times they do, spread their hours out in a way that provokes their symptoms less. It can be really intense when you do long shifts for just a couple of days, and these aren't possible for all occupations, but they are for some. And sometimes it's about education of the people around you. With a long-term pain condition, it's pretty much invisible to a lot of people around you. You look the same as other people, so why is it that you're having these problems? And sometimes it needs a little bit of education about conditions, things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, about why you can't do certain things in the way that your colleagues do. And with return to hobbies and activities like sports, it might be that you have to go through some gentle graded exercises that lead up to that. It might be you do some small routines in the gym or at home first of all before you progress towards the thing you want to be doing. And it might be that you do some sport specific exercise first of all as well. Before you go back to golf, you build up your tolerance of walking. You might do some stretches. It might be you start to pick up the golf club and practice your swing, and then go and practice on the putting range. Just do a few shots first of all and build yourself up slowly. It might be you're able to build up towards things like pitch and putt, and it might be you build up slowly before you go back to doing the full golf course. You take your time, you do it in a non-competitive way, and hopefully make that return that you're looking to achieve. So we talked about things like returning to sport and work, but sometimes just even getting through the day can be a challenge. There's long-term conditions, things like fibromyalgia, things like long COVID where we're making a recovery, where just even doing your daily activities like washing and dressing, preparing meals can be a challenge. So under those circumstances, we'd actually start to look at things a bit like your car. With your car, you put fuel in the engine, and that fuel tank's only got so much capacity. And that fuel might drive you back and forwards to work in a week. But sometimes when we've got a condition that involves fatigue, it might be you've only got a small fuel tank, and that when we know tasks, even things like washing and dressing, things like commuting to work, so start to think about your week. Start to think about the tasks that you do. Some of them might be more physical, some of them might involve more mental fatigue, but try and spread them through your week in a way that doesn't leave them all on one day. It might be that you just hoover one room of the house on a given day rather than trying to hoover the whole house in one go before a guest comes round. It might be that you have to concede that when somebody else does the washing up, they don't do quite as good a job, not up to your high standards. But if you've still got energy then to do some of the things you want to do, then hopefully you'll have a better quality of life and more enjoyment of life. Does it need to be done? Is that how it has to be done? Sometimes we have to look at things a little bit more flexibly, to concede certain things, to delegate certain things, and to plan ahead as well. Sometimes knowing where there's a bathroom, knowing where you can sit down on a chair, might allow you to go out and enjoy your day a little bit more. And look at the positions you do certain things in. Sometimes with gardening, it might be you can vary things. It might be you look at having some pots at waist height that you can do so you don't bend over all of the time to do a task. It might be that you vary your position, or just walk for 15 minutes and then have a sit down, so that then you could walk maybe for 45 minutes if you sat down every 15 minutes and had a break, rather than struggling to do a whole half hour and then being fit for nothing for the rest of the day. So think about your tasks a bit like fuel in a fuel tank. Think if every task you do takes a little bit of that fuel, you can either use it up all in one go, which isn't a great strategy, and that's when we leave ourselves fit for nothing, or we could just do small amounts and spread them throughout the week where we're able to delegate where possible, and be realistic about those plans. Sometimes what we set out to achieve might not always be achievable, and be kind to yourself with those thoughts as well. because sometimes the way we treat ourselves isn't the way you treat other people. It isn't how you treat a close friend or a relative. So maybe be a little bit kinder with the thoughts towards yourself, because we often find that people think about themselves quite negatively with long-term conditions, and we need to try and change those ways of thinking as well. So pacing can be useful with recovering from an injury. It can be useful if we're getting over things like a sprained ankle, or trying to get back towards the sports or back into the workplace. And for things like a long-term condition, it can be a fundamental cornerstone of improving your quality of life and living better with those symptoms. I think the most challenging aspect of that is dealing with behaviour. It's really easy to do stretches, it's really easy to try and fit exercise into your life, but fundamentally to change the person you are, to try and do things slightly differently and to think about the world slightly differently, that can be really difficult. And it can involve changing the habits and behaviours of others around you as well, having some awkward conversation in there. So I'd also say for certain things like long-term conditions, pacing is something you never stop doing. You get better at it, but even during a good patch, sometimes human nature is that we test the water, that we have a day we feel good and we try and do a little bit too much and end up dealing with the consequences. And sometimes if it's things like going to a wedding or having a good day out with your friends, it might be worth it, and that's fine. Plan your days so that for the next couple of days you haven't got so much on. Take some annual leave so you don't need to worry about work the next day after going to a concert. We can also look at things like our nutrition. You need fuel in an engine of a car, and in the same way you need to make sure you've got good food and hydration in your diet to make sure that you can get through your day. Look at things like your sleep routine. With certain conditions our sleep can be poor, but actually having a routine, having some circumstances that are favourable might help with that. And avoid unhelpful coping strategies, things like alcohol, things like use of excessive rest to manage our symptoms, because actually in the short term it might feel like it's helping, but it can actually lead to increased problems and other problems that we have to deal with. And look at things like the use of mindfulness. If you're dealing with anxiety, things like mindfulness can be really helpful in trying to focus on the moment and in the present. And deal with anxieties and concerns. It might be conversations with other people can help. And also consider the use of things like stretches and graded exposure, because doing daily exercise in the form of stretches and exercises can actually build you up towards these activities. So there you go. That was the basics of pacing. How was it? Hopefully it was useful. If it was, please either click like or subscribe or leave a comment for the channel. None of those things cost you any money, and it really helps me because it helps to promote the content of the channel with other people that might also find it of use. Thanks for watching, keep safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.